Well, so essentially, we're having an inflationary crisis, and it's hitting developed markets for the first time in decades. I mean, developing countries go through this regularly, at least many of them do. And now it's hitting developed countries across the board, some harder than others, especially Europe, less so Japan, but really across the board. And because that's mainly because commodities are a global market, and that's a big driver of what's causing this, as well as supply chains. And, whereas last year we were in this pure inflationary phase, now we're kind of in the central bank counterattack phase where, they kept saying it was transitory. They kept saying, don't worry about it. This will be, there's base effects and things like that. And some of the base effects were real, but they were sugarcoating the type of inflation that we were actually getting and probably about to get. And because they weren't acknowledging how much new currency supply was created in a short period of time compared to real world constraints around commodities and logistics and things like that. And so now we've added a Russian war to the mix, right? So that further makes it challenging to, optimize commodities where they need to be. And then we also have very draconian Chinese lockdowns, very large percentage of the population. And that's the manufacturing hub of the world and the shipping hub of the world. And so that kind of gums up the supply chain problems. And so we both have limitations in the real world side while also having a lot of currency having been created. And so now we're seeing the inflation roll through the system. And it's particularly getting bad in Europe, but it's bad, throughout the world at this point. And so now central banks have their credibility threatened, where they said it was transitory. It's far higher and less transitory than they kind of sold the idea would be. And so now they're in the phase where they're trying to tighten policy, but the whole point is that unlike, say, the 70s, there's so much debt in the system that trying to tighten policy is kind of this temporary thing where they want to act like they can stabilize this whole thing. We can get back to positive real rates. We can totally normalize this. But the problem is that the only way for the central bank to push back on inflation is to reduce demand. They can't print oil. They can't print copper. They can't print ships. They can't, just magically create new pipelines and get all that stuff where it needs to be. And so they say, okay, there's a supply side constraint. We have high inflation. If we reduce demand, we can take the edge off prices. But what is a reduction in demand? It's a recession, right? And so right now, inflation is very politically unpopular, but you can bet that if you were to reduce demand and increase unemployment, you'd have different types of things that are unpopular, right? That would also be unpopular. And I think that at the very core of it, there's two main problems. One is we've underinvested in energy in multiple ways for several years. And so there's just not enough energy and it doesn't get easily to where it needs to go. So that's number one. And that's very different than the past decade where we spent a large portion of the time with an energy oversupply because we brought in a lot of new types of oil to market, particularly shale. And we also had a slowdown in emerging markets. So demand was less than anticipated and supply was more than anticipated. So we had this glut of oil for a period of time. And that really destabilized prices, brought them low. That's good for some industries, obviously bad for the producers. But now, due to the combination of nobody wanting to invest in that because the prices were so low, and because of ESG concerns and things like that, there's been underinvestment, and we've kind of drawn forward a lot of the benefits we got from shale, right? So that rapid increase in shale can't just keep continuing the way it was, right? There's only so much shale oil that's available. It has very fast decline rates. It requires constant capital injection. So now we're in this phase where we don't really have enough energy, and it also doesn't get to where it needs to be. And so that's just a constraint, and that takes time to work through. The market forces have to work through that and find new energy to bring to market, different types of energy. And of course, the other one is the whole supply chain. So for the past 10, 20, 25, 30 years, we've had this period of persistent globalization where, we're finding these big pockets of labor throughout the world that were previously relatively unused in the global market sense, and optimizing that, or geographic arbitrage, where you say, okay, so instead of having this expensive factory in, Detroit, we'll go ahead and move it to China, right? And so you arbitrage that labor cost difference, and we've had that pressure for, really for 25 years now, especially the Chinese part of it. And, in some ways it's been longer than that, but really that past 20, 25 year period has been very aggressive in terms of how much globalization's happened. And that's been a very disinflationary force. And so the concern is that as that kind of levels out, and then, even if it just doesn't deglobalize, if it just stops continuing to globalize, that's going to probably be inflationary. And then as it if it actually pulls back, and we actually pull some supply chain back to the developed world, that's even more inflationary. And of course, that benefits some of the workers in those countries, right? So it's the whole thing is kind of based on where you are in the system, what you want out of the system. And the main takeaway, I think, is that the next 10, 20 years look very different than the past 10, 20 years.